So I have been following your work for some time, and it's one of those crazy things where you sort of feel like you know someone
Right.
because you've listened to their commentary for quite some time, and that's how I feel about you. But for our audience that might be coming to you for the first time, just let us know a little bit about where they can find you, and maybe let us know a little bit about your own background in all of this stuff.
So my channel is Gnostic Informant. I started it about 3 years ago, almost exactly 3 years ago. And it's basically doing deep dives into ancient history, mythology, critically examining Bible history, stuff like that. Very critical of Christianity.
Hmm.
A lot of some Jungian stuff, approaching Gnosticism and Jungian style, not a Christian style, that kind of thing. My background is a little unique, I guess. I, you know, I was through high school and in my early 20s, I was kind of a hothead, kind of an idiot, got into a lot of trouble, and long story short, ended up in prison and for
Oh,
possession.
wow.
Yeah, yeah. But that's when I started to become a reader.
Interesting.
And yeah, and
So you were in position for possession of drugs, something like
yes.
this? Okay. Well,
Oh yeah, I was total
none of us are
degen.
perfect.
Yeah, I was total. I'm forward with. I was a total degenerate in my teenage years, and
Hmm.
I turned 21 in prison, and I'm 34 now, so that was a while ago.
Wow.
But that's just part of my history. It is what it is. And but I became a reader. I've actually found Jordan Peterson in there, and this is
Wow.
before 12 Rules of Life. Yeah, this is like no one. I don't even think. I think people in the academic world knew who he was, but
Hmm.
it's a weird story. My mom was like, "I'm going to send you some self help books." I was like, "Whatever." She sends me Maps of Meaning. I don't know how she found that book because I don't even think it's a
Interesting.
self help psychology
No.
book. However, she found that book. It got sent to me in prison. I read that. Just got fascinated by it. I didn't even understand any of it. It was all
Hmm.
gibberish to me. Like I'm reading through this stuff. I'm like, what does any of this mean? I had no idea. But then I got interested in the Bible because Jordan Peterson's always talking about the Bible. So I read the
Right.
Bible cover in there. So that's how I got interested in Christianity and early mythology, and I actually became a Christian in there, which is like part of
Hmm.
the reason how I cleaned up my life and stuff like that. And I became like a fundamentalist, hardcore Christian for a while, for years. And then I studied my way out of Christianity. I started
Hmm.
reading Nietzsche. Holy shit, this dude Nietzsche is fucking on point. He's making me stupid right now. And so I studied my way out of Christianity just by reading about comparative mythology, James Frazier, uh,
Okay.
Nietzsche,
Interesting.
Young, stuff like that. And that's when I realized this isn't true. And not only is it not true, this is like the cancer of society.
Hmm.
And I'm reading a book by Van Loon. He's like a 1920s author, geographer, and he has a whole chapter about how communism comes from Christianity. He said
Hmm.
the whole social justice idea of like the weak are the best, the lowest are the high, because Jesus says the last will be first and the first will be last.
Sure.
And he makes this amazing argument. People should go read it. It's called Van Loon Geography. It's an old book. It's so old that it uses the word Negro still.
Hmm.
It's one of those older books, very outdated, but it's still a good book. I still like it. I got it from my grandfather when he passed away. I took all of his books from his library. He was a big reader. He's a genius dude, German guy. And so I read that book and I was like, I realized that makes a lot of sense. Like the world that we're in right now. There's two sides of the same coin. There's the Christian conservative side, and they think they're the opposing the social justice movement, but really they're just creating that. They're creating their own
Yeah.
opposition. Because once you stop believing Christianity, what you once you get rid of the mythology around Christianity, you're left with the same principles that are there, which is Caesar bad, Caesar the devil. And
Yeah.
if you think about the psychology behind that, Caesar was the top of the hierarchy. It was the old Roman religion, the one that I think I romanticize the old religions all the time on my channel. You know that from watching me.
Hmm.
I love Greek religion, the Roman religion. I think the Pythagorean model was perfect. But they had a hierarchy. Caesar's on top, and then the patricians, then the equestrians, military, then the plebs, and then down. No. And so Christianity flips that on its head and says now instead of having Caesar as God, he's the devil. See Nero 666, the devil,
Hmm.
and back then the Jews were like the poorest people. They were impoverished, and now he's got this Jewish person is God, like literally flipping the poles on its head. And
Yeah.
so all of a sudden, being impoverished and being having poverty was something to be proud of, and riches was something that was it's a very cynic. I don't know if you know the cynic philosophers, Diogenes, Crates, those guys
Hmm.
from pre those guys were all like, don't have any wealth. If you give me any money, I'm throwing it out. I don't care.
Hmm.
They hate wealth, and the Christians sort of adopt that cynic attitude. But yeah, I said a lot there. So what do you think about all that?
Yeah, no, I think that's great stuff. I definitely think there is what we would in this community call a caducean quality between left and right. And when what that is, two snakes fighting each other, but it's a kind of false opposition or synthetic opposition. It's the Yankees versus the Red Sox, in effect, or two, professional wrestlers battling. But, who wins in the end? The baseball does, or the wrestling foundation or something, because it's a fake battle. And it's
Right.
meant to kind of confuse, and it's actually Mercury's staff, famously. And you'll see this as well with Moses and other figures. But yeah, I mean, it is a kind of curious thing when you meet right-wing Christians. I mean, I saw some highlights from a men's Christian conference that happened, I think, like 2 weeks ago or something like this. And they literally had a tank on stage that like crushed cars, and then they had someone firing weapons from the cars. They'll just do this totally silly, over the top, macho stuff that seems to be just. I mean, it's stupid in itself, but it more importantly, it's kind of like radically disconnected from the message of Jesus. And Nietzsche is obviously thought of himself as an antichrist and so on, but he did have enough respect for Jesus to represent what that man actually said. Um,
Sure.
Jesus was a bit of um, a hippie, anti-war, vagabond, leftist. I mean, there's just no question that Jesus would be protesting the Pharisees, in fact, at Columbia University right now, if he were alive. He would be sitting. There's also no doubt that he would have partaken of weed and stuff like that. I mean, it's just that this is the archetypal figure that he represents. Now, he was also very extreme. It's like if you want to murder in your heart, you are a murderer, in fact. And we've all wanted to kill someone, at some point, or we've all lusted after some woman, and we are an adulterer because of that. So he was deeply sincere and kind of, I guess you could say, puritanical or extreme. But then to get away from his actual message, I mean, you kind of see these groups like the Christian men's group, and you wonder, like, what Bible are you reading? I mean, it's just bizarre. I mean, I think a lot of atheists or Nietzscheans or whatever, they at least show Christianity the respect to actually read it and take it seriously and find Jesus kind of fascinating, if any, if even if we disagree with him, just kind of like a genuine figure out
Exactly.
there. Yeah.
Well said. This he's the ultimate countercultural icon.
Yeah.
He is like he's walking around, he's yelling at cursing people, kicking people, whipping people. He's like kind of like he's just going around, and he's unpredictable. You
Hmm.
don't know, like when it comes to like the girl, the adulterer, she's like, oh, she's good, chill out, you guys are all a bunch of sinners too, who cares? And then when
Yeah.
it comes to like someone's selling something in the temple, which was everyday business. Now he's flipping out, but you kind of see that with well, not liberals. I would say more of leftist
Hmm.
ideology. They're very open to certain things, but then very strict on other things. So
Hmm.
so I think 2,000 years of making this man the icon sort of led to that spirit of the West where we are very lenient and very liberal on certain things, but then when it comes to other things, it's completely like you can't do that. That's blasphemy. You're gonna we have that weird schizophrenic mindset happening right now in
Yeah.
our
Well,
you know.
it is weird because it's almost like it's a mix and match or replacement kind of quality. So, um, for instance, today, if someone is, say, a single mother, I got pregnant when I was 18, I'm raising the kid alone. I don't even know who the father was. Well, people would, even Christians would probably say, well, that's okay. We support you. Or some would say you're empowered or whatever. If the idea of being a single woman, even 50 years ago, or certainly 100 years ago, that would be just
Right.
unbearably embarrassing. Your father would probably encourage you to get an abortion, in fact, which is another kind of twist on these things. And you would have been filled with shame and ostracized from the community. Again, then we have today where it's like, oh my God, we found the racist emails from, a football coach. I'm just using
Right.
just one example. It's like, 10 years ago, he sent a racist email. Like, oh my God, what a maniac, a horrible person. So it's like we have this,
Exactly.
requisite amount of self-righteousness and morality, but where it's directed kind of depends. It's like we have a fire hose of self-righteousness, but we kind of like point it at different people, in a way, but it's kind of like the same intensity. So I don't think we live in like an amoral society, or we don't, nothing matters or something like this, like a lot of conservatives would say, like, oh, they're just a bunch of amoralist hedonists or whatever. I don't think we are. I think we live in a kind of hyper puritanical society, but it's where that morality is pointed is kind of the issue.
Yeah, that was exactly what I meant. It was well,
Hmm.
that's exactly what I was trying to say. And it's and that's why I think after 2000, well, 1800, I guess you'd say, because people were pagans for the first couple hundred years when Christianity was around. But whatever,
Hmm.
like roughly 18, 1700 years of making this the pinnacle icon for everybody to follow by led to this spirit that we have in the West. If that
Hmm.
makes sense. If you
Absolutely.
look, you read the ancient sources of Suetonius or Plutarch or Cassius Dio, and the way he describes people in those times was so different. It's like a different universe. It's like
Hmm.
a people just had or they just had a different way of looking at the world back then. But yeah, that's the way it
Well,
is.
one of the things I wanted to talk about was kind of mythicism in general. And because we're talking about Jesus, maybe this would be a good place to start. So I recently wrote a piece on Euripides the Bacchae. And it's actually in our book. I'll probably publish it on the web at some point just to, get the word out or something. But um, it's a remarkable play. So it was Euripides' final play, and so it's kind of the final play of that Attic period of Sophocles, Aeschylus, Euripides, the great tragedy, high tragedy. Um, but and it's a very relevant play in many ways. So you have this figure Pentheus, who's kind of the man of law and order, and Euripides comes to town, and he's demanding to be accepted as a god. In fact, to be accepted as the son of God.
You said Euripides,
Uh,
you meant Dionysus.
Oh, Dionysus, excuse me. Yeah, Euripides is the playwright. Yeah. So Dionysus comes to town and he's demanding to be accepted as God, in fact, the son of God. So um,
Yeah,
his
he
mother,
says first line in the play is the Son of God has entered into the world.
yes.
Son of, it says Son of Dios. which is the genitive form of Zeus. But like that's son of God. Like Zeus was the high god. That was the highest.
Right.
He's actually called Zeus Hypsistos, God Most High. That's the same
Hmm.
title you get of the Bible. So in the same sense of John. By the way, I didn't mean to cut you off. I'll let you finish your plot, but
No,
real
it's a.
quick, this text becomes the central myth of Dionysus because there's many myths of Dionysus, and
Hmm.
Nonus in the 5th century A.D. puts them all together in what's called the Dionysica, but they were all scattered around in different plays and different texts and different hymns. But this Euripides creates this masterpiece as you're talking about. Dennis McDonald, a friend of mine who's a scholar,
Hmm.
from I think Princeton, I think whatever, doesn't matter. But he wrote a book called the Dionysian Gospel, and it's showing how, as like just like as we just mentioned, the Son of God enters the world. He demands to be worshipped. If you don't give him that worship, you're done. Just
Hmm.
like Jesus, John's gospel. It's called the Dionysian Gospel. It's amazing. He basically lays out like the gospel of whoever wrote the Gospel of John was using Euripides Bacchae as like a sort of like a structure to follow to make to map Jesus onto.
It's incredible. I know I'm gonna buy that book right away, actually, because this is kind of exact. He probably got to where I got like 10
Yeah,
years before I did, so I should. I'll be disappointed, actually.
first thing he lays out is because people might say, "Well, that's crazy. Jewish people didn't care about Greeks," and he first thing he lays out is he shows people who learned Greek had to learn the way they were taught in Alexandria and Pergamum and in these libraries. We have it all documented in many sources. They were taught to copy Homer and Euripides. That's how they
Hmm.
learned Greek. So the Gospel of John, it's written in Greek. So he had to learn Greek somewhere, which means he probably knew Homer, Euripides. He probably had to copy it. So there's no doubt in his mind and in the way he lays it out, there's no doubt that they knew about these texts. There's no doubt
Yes.
about it. And by the way, these were the classics even back then. So
Hmm.
it's like everyone knew Euripides, but yeah,
Yeah.
I caught you.
And well, it's also it's a curious comparison, Dionysus and Jesus, because thinking about coming from the perspective of our day and age, we would say these two figures are totally opposed. It's the god of wine and drunkenness, and he's creating orgies in the city of Thebes, where all the women are going out to the wilderness. They're like dressing with they're strapping snakes onto garments, and they're suckling wolves and deer, and it seems to be metaphorical, maybe not metaphorical. They're also scratching the earth and bringing up milk and honey, which is also fascinating metaphor from the Old Testament, Canaan, the land of milk and honey. But these are probably artistic metaphors for what was just a crazed drunken orgy. I mean, that's what's going on. And so, from our perspective, we would say, oh, Jesus and Dionysus, they couldn't be further apart. They're totally different. But you start digging in and you find how similar they are. As you were saying with John, I mean, um, Jesus is, wherever he goes, he is like this figure of Dionysus, a figure of chaos, of upsetting the order. Pentheus is king of Thebes. He's being challenged by this god who's just kind of invincible and knocks down his temples, and it can be chained and can unchain himself, and so on. And then also there's that curious aspect of Dionysius's birth. So Semele is his mother. She is, and Dionysus and Pentheus are related. They're cousins, in fact. But she has one of these. She's one of many of Zeus's conquest, and but Hera whispers into her ear. Because Hera, understandably, is outraged, and Hera whispers in her ear, "Well, why don't you make Zeus prove to you he's a god? I don't think he's really a god. You should make him prove it." So Zeus, unfurls himself, and she's burnt to a crisp. And Dionysus is a babe in her womb, and Zeus takes the fetus from Semele and implants it into his own thigh. And so you see
Here,
here a kind of version of the conception, and it's a god, inseminating a mortal woman, and you have this son of God who's also mortal. And Dionysus, goes through town disguised as a human being. And so you can see a sort of incarnation. I am the son of God, even though I'm also just a man. And and so you're chomping at the bit to start talking, so I'll leave it there. But yeah, go ahead in terms of these amazing kind of connections between the figure of Jesus and Dionysus.
So yeah, this there's so much that we can say. First of all, you're right that they are opposites, and
Hmm.
in the same way um as someone would borrow from any other genre and sort of change it into their own, and then what matters is the differences. So even though the sequence of events lines up from the Bacchae and John's gospel, Jesus is a flipping of it. He's an anti Dionysus.
Hmm.
But, but let's put that aside for now because I want to talk about the birth thing for a second. So it is really crazy how he has a mortal mother, um, and but in John's gospel, it makes it clear that the logos was there in the beginning. So he's there before he's born. Well,
Hmm.
what the hell does that mean? Well, and once again with Dionysus, you discover that's not the first time he was born. Dionysus was actually born in heaven in Olympus through the Kori, which is the virgin.
Hmm.
Kori is a Greek word that means maiden, but it also is used for virgin in some cases. So it's like a dual has two different meanings. But Persephone, she's the Kori.
Hmm.
That's his first mother. Dionysus is born twice. So the first time he's born, it's Zeus and Persephone. And Persephone is the queen of the underworld. She's the Kori, and Zeus makes love with her and bores this child Zagreus. And the text, Nonus relays the text. We lost the original version of this story, but there's like fragments of it. But Nonus in the 5th century rewrites the story, and it basically comes down to Dionysus was chosen to be the heir of Zeus.
Hmm.
Nowhere, nobody else in any Greek mythology is the heir of Zeus. So it starts off with Uranos. He's the first king of heaven. The heir of him is Saturn, and then Zeus, then Dionysus. So so that needs to be established when we're talking about how important Dionysus is in comparison to like who is Jesus going to draw from? Who would be the go-to? Why not Apollo? Why
Hmm.
not Asclepius? Why not Dionysus is the pinnacle of the sons of God. He's
Hmm.
the heir to Olympus. He is going to be the king of heaven. But Hera, again, she does this again before the assembly thing. She plots. She doesn't want Dionysus to be the king of heaven. She doesn't like Persephone. She doesn't like what's going on. She feels threatened by this whole situation. So she sends the Titans to go and rip Dionysus apart, kill him
Hmm.
as a baby. He's like 1 day old. He's newborn baby gets ripped apart and killed, and then he resurrects. So you already have a dying and rising resurrection of this baby Zagreus. He resurrects in the form of Dionysus, and that's when the play starts. So Euripides is basically starting the play after those events. So
Hmm.
he's already resurrected. He's already risen, and now he's coming into the world as the Son of God. So right off the bat, we already have two different heirs to the kingdom of heaven. Jesus is the heir to the kingdom of heaven, right? And so is Dionysus. They're both dying and rising. They both die, rise up, and then return. And then, and I want to let you comment on this, but
Hmm.
the thing that's crazy about the whole Pentheus and Dionysus thing is like Pentheus seems to play that role of the Pharisees, or I should say, the Pharisees are playing
Yes.
the of Pentheus in
Yeah.
so many ways. And just he's trying to trip him up. He's trying to get him to say things that he shouldn't say. It's like the same tricks are being played. And Dionysus is just like his attitude is so much like how and like obviously I'm talking about it in backwards because the gospels are 300 years later, I think 300 or 400 years later, maybe even
Hmm.
more than that. And uh his attitude is just like Dionysus in the Bacchae. There's so much you can say about that. You have to read it to understand what we're saying. But it gets even but then it's all even more clear at the end. After Pentheus gets it's almost like a crucifixion scene the way Pentheus gets killed, which is another interesting note, because then you're seeing there's a flipping of the poles here. Instead of Pentheus being the one being killed, Jesus is the one being killed. So
Hmm.
I should say, instead of Dionysus being killed, it's Jesus. But the thing I wanted to say is, after that happens, Agave, Pentheus's mother, after she comes back from her frenzy, she just killed her own son through the magic of Dionysus possessing her mind, making her do all this crazy stuff. And she comes to and goes, "Oh my God!" And she looks at Dionysus and she goes, "You are the Son of God." And
Yeah.
it's just like the end of the Gospels when the women are at the tomb and they realize he did rise. And then Jesus says, or I'm sorry, Dionysus says to Agave,
Well, it's like Mary Magdalene who doesn't fully recognize that I don't know if this is in McDonald's book. I'm going to order it today,
it is
but one of the things in John's gospel that's so fascinating is that they're not recognizing Jesus
not
when he
recognizing, but that's what I was just going to say. So
yeah.
Agave doesn't, the whole time she's like, I don't know if he's the Son of God. I don't know if he's lying.
Hmm.
NPS might be right. He might be an imposter. But then at the end, she realizes he's the one. And then you know what
Hmm.
Dionysus says to her? He says, "It's too late. The hour has come, and the wages of sin is death. You didn't believe in me before the hour has come."
Mm.
That is so Jesus-y. So like
Yes.
that's Jesus. What happens to people who don't believe in him? They're done. It doesn't
Right.
matter how good of a person you are in Christianity. Christianity's whole attitude is, who cares if you're a sinner, just believe in Jesus and you'll be saved. And it doesn't matter
Right.
how good you are. It doesn't matter if you donate all your money to charity. If you don't believe in Jesus, you're done for. Dionysus is exactly the same. His attitude is, I don't care what you do, you just have to follow me and believe me. And if you don't, and it's too late, I don't give a shit. I'm going to turn my back on you. And that's what he
Hmm.
does to Agave. It's the very last passage of the play. And it's a tragedy, because finally believes in him, and it's too late. And
Mm.
it's like, you could see how the Christian gospels are drawing from that attitude of faith. It's a faith thing. It really
Yeah.
is.
Yeah, it's one of these things where in the book that Mark and I are finishing up finally there is we disagree with Nietzsche so many times because Nietzsche in The Birth of Tragedy, Nietzsche's take on this was that Euripides was a kind of bourgeois playwright and he hated the Dionysian, the chaos and the fury, this terrible notion that we're better that you were not born because life is suffering and so on. And he was trying to banish Dionysus from the stage, but he couldn't, and so he just threw up his hands. That's basically Nietzsche's take on it. But I think Nietzsche is wrong. I think he can be insightful and wrong. It happens. But I
Yeah.
think the Euripides Bacchae is kind of announcing the coming God. It's a tragedy. There's no doubt, but it is bringing forth a new era. And there's many lines in there of saying there is no God greater than Dionysus or something. So he's greater than the Father, that is Zeus. And it is a revolutionary, kind of amazing text when you actually look at it and see what's happening. But also in terms of Pentheus, I guess what I suggest in the piece is that he's kind of like the perfect foil to Dionysus in the way that the Pharisees are to Jesus. And it's a caducean relationship. So, you know, yeah, I probably sympathize with Pentheus a little bit, but he's also a hypocrite. Like he wants to go look at the orgies. It's one of these like Republicans that are like we've got to get to the bottom of what's going on in San Francisco right now. He's one of these kind of are the preacher the preacher who denounces homosexuality and then 2 weeks later he's caught with meth and homosexual prostitutes or whatever. It always happens, and it's
Happens all.
like this setup to inaugurate the new thing. So it's like who can sympathize with the Pharisees? They're a bunch of legalistic jerks. Of
Right.
course Jesus. And Pentheus, he's a hypocrite. And at the end, Dionysus tricks him into dressing as a woman. So he's like, well, if you really want to spy in these orgies, you should dress as a woman. And Pentheus's response is, I'm man enough to do this. So he's like the drag queen. I'm man enough to dress as a woman and go watch my mother take part in God knows what. I mean, it's he's kind of like he's kind of like the fall guy, I guess, that justifies Dionysus. That's at least my take on it.
Yeah, and so if you actually look at the political situation of that time period, it's right around where you have tyranny being taken down and democracy replacing it.
Mm-hmm.
So um, Pentheus almost represents the oligarchy, the tyrant, the leader of the archon, the leader of the city. He is the prince. Like his father is Cadmus. He's the king. By the way,
Right.
Cadmus is Dionysus's uh, uncle or grandfather, because no, Cadmus is the mother of or father of Semele, so it is his
Correct.
grandfather. It's
Yes.
through. It's like through
They're cousins, I believe is what they are. Yeah. Or something like
grandfather.
that. Yeah. Yeah.
His other half grandfather would be Saturn. But anyways, Pentheus is the prince. He's the heir uh to Thebes. He's going to be the next
Mm-hmm.
king. But Dionysus sort of sets in this play sort of highlights the attitude of people wanting democracy in Athens in that time. And we know how that ended up. It wasn't really that great of a project. There were some problems with it. But regardless, at that time, that was what was going on. You had people wanting democracy, wanting to get rid of the oligarchical system. The 30 Tyrants event happened where they
Mm-hmm.
went and took down the 38 tyrants and a big revolution. And they were being inspired by the Dionysian at that period, at that time.
Mm-hmm.
They're wanting, because if you look at a lot of these Dionysian cults, especially the ones, there's one well documented by Livy in Italy, and it's they got outlawed in 186 BCE. It's a famous event.
Oh yeah.
Um, and there was a girl named Annia Capula, and she was the leader of this cult, this orgiastic cult, where it was very egalitarian, and there was like homosexuality, and
Mm-hmm.
because the Dionysian sort of could take people to that place, if that makes sense. So that was like a sort of a side effect of the Dionysian rise in culture at that time. And obviously, like Nietzsche highlights this stuff, and the Apollonian sort of is the balance of that, the
Mm-hmm.
order, the hierarchy.
Well, also, I mean, Dionysus, I mean, and this is something that we suggest. I mean, Dionysus is likely a very old god because he's
Exactly.
Homer is aware of him. Now, all of these things, they
Name
always get,
his
oh,
name
say again?
shows up. His name shows up in Linear B. That's before
Oh,
Greek.
interesting.
He's
Interesting.
actually he was actually around in the Bronze Age, so that's how old he
Wow.
is. Older
Yeah.
than Yahweh. Older than Yahweh.
Interesting. So and look, all of mythology is a kind of like rewriting and kind of spinning or revising. It's very similar to, modern myths like comic books. Like we kind of do a retcon or we create a new variation on this or we change the character's gender or race or whatever. And it's
The
just
political
natural.
the political atmosphere of the time will influence how the texts are written. The dominating philosophy will. So that's what happens with the Gospels. And even though it's drawing the same structure as a tragedy as the Bacchae,
Hmm.
it's also influenced by the current Middle Platonism of the day, Stoicism,
Right.
Platonism, Neo-Pythagoreanism, and that's all getting drawn into Jesus. And so that's how you get a different hero. So it's like even though it's drawing all these comparisons, it's also changing them into the current times. So yeah, exactly what you were saying. Dionysus and the Bacchae is not the Dionysus from the Bronze Age. It's totally different
Right.
Dionysus, but it's influenced by the culture of the time. So whatever the geopolitical situation is, or whatever philosophies are dominant in that time period, that's how Euripides is going to be influenced to write his play.
Right. But don't I guess what I was suggesting is a figure like Apollo who is also a god of music, but he's also a god of clarity, intelligence, but maybe clarity is the right word. He also carries a bow and he he's kills the serpent and all these kinds of things. That maybe even Apollo was generated as a kind of response to Dionysus because he's also a son of God. And
Right.
he's not one of the original Olympians that was in the belly of Saturn that Zeus liberated. He kind of comes later, and you could see a kind of Apollo as a response to the Dionysian, as to say, well, yeah, he is a god of music, but he's a god of precision and clarity and beauty. And we don't want to be a Pentheus and basically be a prude. We actually want art, but it has to be done in a way that is life affirming and doesn't kind of lead to the chaos. Because I mean, I would say with Dionysus, I mean, he's always been a god of drunkenness. So I mean, he gives you a an image of the left, I guess you could say, as kind of inherently being about like losing yourself,
Yeah.
and getting wasted and kind of
Liberation.
going to another world. And also that I think Nietzsche actually describes the Dionysian quite well. It's, when you're in a rock concert, say, and the lights are off and everyone's singing the words and kind of moving, there's no differentiation between you and the people around you. You start to become a kind of mass. You're all one. And I think that's a kind of primitive or primal version of democracy, basically, is that we're just all the same in this kind of thing. So I think the left, like writ large, like I think it's always been Dionysian. It's always been about sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And it can be democratic, it can be about equality, it can be about women in the workplace, it can be about a lot of different things, but its primal essence is that of the orgy.
Yeah. And so, as I mentioned, with what Livy records these Bacchic, purely Dionysian cults all across Italy, and they're ran by women. So, like, there's
Hmm.
one aspect: women are in charge, and it's liberation, it's equality, it's the and so um he's actually his song, and this is not just neat. So people think Nietzsche is like making this up in his whole. This is all this stuff is backed up by the primary sources.
Hmm.
So Aristotle even says the songs of Dionysus are called the dithyrambos, and it's
Hmm.
a wild chord. So it's really like hardcore music. It's like rock. It's like punk rock or rap music. And then Apollo's songs are called the paean, and those songs are usually
Hmm.
performed in triumph during some sort of celebration or marriage, or it's more constructed. It's more clear clarity, like you said.
Hmm.
It's not wild. It's the opposite of wild. It's very controlled. It's beautiful music. Performed with the lyre and stuff like that. And
Hmm.
Dionysus is like people are playing the flutes, the drums and stuff. It's a little more wild. So there's the music aspect. They're different. And then Apollo is a heavenly god. He's in the sky. He's the sun sometimes.
Hmm.
Dionysus is chthonic. He's the underworld. He's got
Right.
horns in some depictions. He used to be a barley god before he was a wine god. Sabazius. That's a whole nother aspect. But
Right.
I definitely want to get into that because it
He was
gets
into
into the whole
beer before wine. I
yeah,
guess. Yeah.
the whole Lamb of God thing. There's something to say about that. But just to stay on this one topic for while
Hmm.
we're on it, they actually do produce sort of a yin and the yang. And if you're purely Dionysian, you're going to end up in these Bacchic orgiastic cults. And if you're purely Apollonian, you're going to end up with like a tyrannical system of autocratic government. Like it's going to be like king on top, and then
Hmm.
but it might be orderly, it might work, but it might be shitty for people who are not in power. So and that's why in Latin the name of Dionysus is Liber Pater,
Yeah.
the free father. He's the liberator. When you get drunk, you get free. You're liberated. You feel
Yeah.
free. You loosen up. So he's the loose, and that's actually one of his terms, Eleusinian. Loosen. It means loosen in Greek. Eleusinian mysteries is based around him and Demeter.
Right.
But yeah, there's they're opposites. But this is the last thing I wanted. This is what I wanted to say. Macrobius. I don't know if you ever heard of Macrobius. He's one of the last great pagan authors of the era of the Roman times. I think 4th or 5th century, way late in the game. And he talks about how Apollo and Dionysus are the same god, two different faces of the same god. One of them is
Interesting.
heavenly, one of them chthonic. But he says, this is what he says. He says the reason why we know this is in Athens. They had a famous calendar, and on this calendar they marked half the year with the face of Dionysus, and the other half of the year with the face of Apollo. So all the spring and summer season is all dedicated to Apollo. And then once the fall comes, they have the Dionysia festival. That's when everyone gets initiated in the Eleusinian mysteries, and then
Hmm.
it's the dark season. It's when rises up, and that's Hades, and that's Dionysus's time. But it's the two faces. It's like a Janus thing too. So it's
Yeah,
two faces. And Macrobius lays this out. He says they're the same God, and
fascinating.
he also says they're born on December 25th in that text. Says he says if you look at that calendar, I really I'm telling everybody here you should check this out for yourself. Don't just take my word for it because nobody knows about this.
Hmm.
Nobody talk. Everybody just it doesn't really mean anything. But it's like oh, it's late anyway. He might be borrowing from Christianity. That's not true because Plutarch says Hippocrates is born in December. Anyways, um, he says that if you look at the calendar on December 25th, on the he says winter solstice, which at that time during the Julian calendar was December 25th.
Hmm.
Now it's the third. But back then, the winter solstice was December 25th. So he says December 20. He says winter solstice, which is December 25th, and he says if you look at the calendar, they show Dionysus as a baby, and then
Mm.
during the summer at the summer solstice, they show him as a grown man with a beard.
Mm.
So there's evidence that he's born on December 25th, but and people say, "Oh, it's late," so they're borrowing from the Christians. Well, as I said, Plutarch in a late first century, early second century text before Christian. By the way, there's no December 25th in the Bible. That comes later.
Right.
He says, he says that Harpocrates, the divine child of Isis, was born on the winter solstice. So that's a pagan thing. All right.
Yeah, fascinating stuff. um, so let's let's talk a little bit, I guess, about Yahweh. Because we've gone into Jesus. I mean, do you think there's some other? I mean, there's some other precedents for Jesus, I would imagine. I mean, something like Adonis, but
Yeah.
Adonis is a kind of bacchanal
Yeah.
figure as well. It seems to Jesus seems to emerge from a kind of broader Dionysian.
Yeah.
Um,
The Adonis thing. He's obviously drawing. Adonis is like a late version of the god Tammuz
mhm,
from the Sumerians. And there's a million reasons why we know this because he's the base. So the myth of Adonis and Venus is basically a retelling of Ishtar and Tammuz
mhm,
and weeping for Adonis. Adonis is dead, and at well, in some of the versions is Astarte if it's the Phoenician version, but the Latin version by Ovid it's Venus, and she's weeping over the death of Adonis, and then her tears drop down and mixes with his blood, and a rose comes up, and it
mm,
represents his resurrection. So he is a dying and rising God, and that's in that aspect, as James Frazier points out. But it's the ritual mourning for Adonis that's celebrated every year at the spring equinox during Easter time, and
right,
it's not called the Adonia festival. So this predates Christianity. They do a weep, and this is like I mean, what's the Easter festival? It's celebrating the death and resurrection of. It's not the birth of Jesus. That's December
right.
25th. It's the death of Jesus, and this is what the Adonia festival was. It's celebrating the death of Adonis in his rise. But then if you go down in Egypt, they do the same exact festival, but they call it the Hilaria, and it's
Hmm.
for Cyrus. Same time, same week of the year, and
Mm,
everything. It's Isis weeping for Osiris, same time of the year. And then it gets even crazier. In Rome, they had another festival that they started in around 200 BC, all the way up until the Common Era. It's a famous spring equinox festival called the Hilaria, and it's
hmm.
for Attis. So they ritually mourn for the death of Attis, and so what they do is this is all documented. We have tons of sources on this. They bring in a um a tree, a evergreen tree,
Hmm.
um, and they bury it like a body. And then 2, or I think it's 2 days later, they have a day of rejoicing. So it's called the day of mourning when they bury this thing.
Hmm.
It's on March 25th every year.
Right.
And then on March 28th, they have a day of rejoicing.
So it's
So
Good
it's like,
Friday in Easter, basically. Yeah, exactly.
shit,
Yeah.
dude, it's crazy. But
Yeah.
but you'll never hear this from Bible scholars. They just James Frazier was all over this shit. Carl Jung was all over this shit. All
Yeah.
the 18th and 19th century German philologists and English philologists, they were all right. This is not new shit. I'm just bringing up stuff they already discovered all this. But for some reason, academia does not touch this stuff. Why? You tell me why. I don't know.
Well, I think academia doesn't want to touch it because at the end of the day, they particularly biblical criticism is done in religious universities. And that doesn't mean that everything they like I think Bart Ehrman is a excellent example of this because he is a nice guy. He's a serious historian who does good work. I mean, I don't want to like throw him under the bus. And he claims to be an agnostic or something like that. He was reared as a fundamentalist Christian. He went to like Moody Bible College, excuse me. Um, I think he's a kind of crypto Christian at the end of the day because
Yeah.
he's against any sort of mythological criticism, and he claims that like there's a historical Jesus that we can find, like he's a real guy. He was walking around dealing with the Pharisees and the Romans. We can find some little shards of evidence to prove this. But at the end of the day, he's justifying Christians. And, isn't it unusual that or curious that this agnostic who is a former Christian is brought to give lectures in all of these churches all the time? And he's like there to debate Christians. The Episcopalians will bring Bart Ehrman in to a chapel and everyone will
They love
celebrate him. Isn't that curious that this atheist is so popular among Christians? And I think the answer is they're like academic criticism, at least of the Bible. I mean, it's there to kind of like maintain Christianity as a fundamental American religion. And we're going to
oh my
criticize it, but not too hard, you know?
right. No, you. I think I figured out what's going on here because
Hmm.
it's not just Bart. It's Dan McClellan. It's this
Yeah.
type of critical scholars, and they criticize all the miracles, and they sort of what they're doing is they're it's almost like they're reforming the Bible for a liberal minded person,
Yeah.
saying the miracles might not be real, but there's still some good lessons in these texts. And Jesus definitely lived. He's definitely a great philosopher. He definitely
Yeah.
definitely like Bart will even go as far as to like say we know Joseph was his father, even though Paul never writes. Paul's letters are before the Gospels. He never says
Right.
anything about Mark's the first gospel ever written. Joseph's not mentioned in Mark. The first time you hear about
Interesting.
Joseph in 85, Matthew's written around 85 AD.
Yeah.
That's the first time Joseph is ever mentioned. Anyways, long story short, Bart, he's like he never he does I heard he doesn't even like me anymore. That's what I've heard through the grapevine. He doesn't want to because I used to talk to him all the time on my channel.
Yeah.
He doesn't like me because I'm always trying to get into the comparative mythology stuff.
Right.
And he doesn't want to do that. And it's like, why? This is what everybody wants to hear. Everybody wants to know. They hate the James Frazier, Carl Jung approach
Hmm.
to studying these texts. They're maintaining the fabric, the bedrock of culture in academia, which is Christian. It
Hmm.
is. I mean, look at all the members in our government are all some sort of Catholic or Protestant or
Yeah.
something. They're keeping these pillars up, even though they appear to be critical. They're and so like Dan McClellan's a perfect example. He's focused. His main focus in his study is to say, well, the Bible's really not that anti-gay as you think it is. It's really not that anti-women as you think it is. And he's sort of like he's selling the Bible to a different person than a
Right.
conservative scholar would do. And I'm thinking, oh, that's probably what's going on here. That's why they get promoted. And anybody who does comparative mythology, they get shunned out the door. David Litwa, who I've had on my channel millions of times, fired from a Catholic university because he's been on my channel. He talks about the dying and rising gods. He talks about Attis. He talks about Adonis, Osiris, all
Right.
the stuff we were talking about. He's written about that stuff. He got fired randomly, and I asked him. I go, is it because of the stuff? He didn't want to get into it with me. He didn't want to tell me any details, but that's what I
Hmm.
think happened. He
No
got
doubt.
fired.
Yeah, because this is what's really radical. And I think it's also more radical than new atheism or something like that, where you basically just say, ah, it's a, pie in the sky myth, but we're the true liberals. I mean, you're kind of again maintaining the civic order just from a different direction. But like diving into it through comparative mythology, like that is genuinely radical because it makes you question a lot of things. I mean, like seeing the wine god quality of Jesus Christ, it's become kind of obvious to people like us, but that's disturbing.
I
And
remember
yeah, go on.
I remember being told Thomas Paine's Age of Reason was outdated nonsense.
Hmm.
Not the philosophical aspect, but when he gets into the Bible stuff, like
Yeah,
he wasn't well trained. He doesn't know anything. And then I finally read it. And I'm like, this stuff all checks out. Everything.
yeah,
I mean, not every, like he thought Jesus was an allegory of the sun. I wouldn't go that far. I mean, you can't prove it otherwise. You
right.
can't disprove that, but I can't really see.
I
I don't
think
know how you
that's
can.
wrong. Yeah.
Yeah, that's wrong. But his other points are on point, and it's like that type of and he's Thomas Paine is shaping the mind of the founding fathers of this time period, and
Hmm.
he's like the original, and that's how you get this. Anyway, that's another topic. But anyways, that approach, the Thomas Paine, the Carl Jung, the James Fraser approach, the Joseph Campbell approach, that is taboo. That is blasphemy. That's
Hmm.
the consensus is all they don't even teach that stuff. I know people who did seminary and got their PhD in theology and religion. They never read Homer. They never were told to read Euripides. Never were told. They don't even know Greek. They just get told to learn Hebrew. They don't even
Hmm.
know Greek. The Gospels are written in Greek. You don't
Hmm.
have to learn. They don't know Plato. I'm like, have you learned? Did you have to learn Plato? I mean, that's the Middle Platonism is the philosophy that Christianity comes out of. No, I never read any
Exactly.
Plato. I've heard this from multiple seminarian students with PhDs that their training is just Dead Sea Scrolls, Hebrew Bible, and the New Testament, and that's
Right.
all they focus. And they're stuck in this. They're like this. They can't. They're missing the whole. They're just looking at one tree and they're missing the whole forest.
Right. So let's talk a little bit about Yahweh. Actually, so where do you think if we can locate Jesus coming from the Dionysian, and I would relate that to Orpheus, Adonis, and some other figures. Where do you think this crazy God of the Old Testament's coming from? Like what are the precedents or comparisons that you can make with him?
I did a whole video on this that was, and it's 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 not what people think at all. So
Mm-hmm.
it's not Yahweh is not old. He's not this ancient
Mm,
going back to the time of Abraham, who doesn't exist, by the way.
right.
Abraham is in the Old Testament is winning all these major wars in the Middle East that are nowhere in the sources anywhere. So that didn't
Yeah.
happen. But Yahweh, it's funny because Plutarch has a whole book about, I think it's like a just like a essay he wrote on who is the God of the Jews. That's what it's literally what it's called, and he concluded that it's an older, some sort of Eastern version of Yahweh or of Dionysus,
Yeah,
which is
I
like
know. It's fascinating.
but the way he argues it is actually pretty. It's fascinating because one of the names of Dionysus in the East was Yao,
Hmm.
Iota, Alpha, Omega, three letters. But you find the oldest forms of Yahweh. By the way, the oldest forms of Yahweh that we find, there are some like old, early Iron Age inscriptions, and there it says it's three letters. It's Yao. It's the
Hmm.
same name. In the Chaldean oracles, it says that the name of Dionysus or the son of Jupiter was Yao, who the Greeks called Dionysus, and he's also the demiurge, is what it says in the Chaldean oracles. And then there's another title for Dionysus in Phrygia, which is modern day Turkey, and it's Sabazius, Saba, and one of the names of Yahweh in the Old Testament is Sabaoth. which
Hmm.
is Lord of Hosts, and Sabbath is sort of comes out of that
Right.
word too. But so he's looking at the linguistic side of it, and then Plutarch says, I also he went to go like study them, and he said the way they dress, the breastplate and the bells in the bottom, he
Hmm.
says it's identical to the priest of the Eleusinian mysteries.
Hmm.
And then I actually, and I, so I don't, I'm like
So
looking,
that
I'm like,
would
how do,
suggest Saturn, who is the king of Elysium. And yeah.
and that's another thing. I have this whole, I have a wild theory that Uranus and Saturn are just an older rendition of Zeus and Dionysus. And here's why I
Hmm.
think that. And I'll circle back to Yahweh as Saturn because there's so much evidence for what
Hmm.
you just said.
Yeah.
So,
So
or
Uranus, you're we usually call that Uranus or Caelus, right? That the sky god is what you're saying.
it,
Yeah.
it means sky father, it means
Yeah.
sky or heaven.
Yeah.
Zeus comes from the Indo-European Dios Pitar, which
Right.
means sky father. Their names is exactly the same. They're both heavenly fathers. And then Saturn is the chthonic sun who emasculates Zeus.
Caelus. Or well,
Or I'm sorry, Uranus. Yeah, Uranus. Yeah,
yeah. Yeah.
Caelus. Latin, it's Caelus. Yeah.
Right.
So that's what I meant. I didn't mean to say Zeus.
Yeah.
Um, and so he's chthonic. He rules Elysium, which is in Hades.
Hmm.
And And so Dionysus is also a chthonic son of the Sky Father who is supposed to succeed his father. So let's put that aside for now. That's my little theory on that.
Hmm.
Or Yahweh and Saturn is there's so much evidence to suggest that this is the same God, some other
Wow.
version, some Eastern rendition. The first thing that I want to point out that's like a slam dunk on this. There's a text from a Bronze Age priest whose name was Sancho Niethan,
Hmm.
and we have lost the original version of this. I don't even know if it we have the full thing, but there's a writer in the first century. His name's Philo of Byblos, the Phoenician, and Eusebius had access to his work, and he
Hmm.
translates it into Greek. And he in this text, this Bronze Age text, it says, it literally says El. El is the Hebrew name for God in the Hebrew
Right.
Bible. El, which is Allah in Arabic. He says El, who the Greeks call Kronos, and is also in
Oh
Latin called
wow.
Saturn. He's literally it's right there. You don't even have to guess. He just tells you this, and then he tells the story of El, and it's the story of Saturn. And then he get this. So now you might be thinking, well, how do you know that's not just going the other way? How do you know they're not just making another version of El from Saturn?
Hmm.
No, 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 no. Check out what he says. He says El. Um, how does he say it? He says El sacrifices his only begotten son, whose name is Yedud. So it almost sounds like Judah. And by the way,
Hmm.
Yedud shows up in Israel coins in the Persian period. So there's some sort of deity named Yedud who's the son
Hmm.
of El, and it's the same scene as Abraham sacrificing Isaac, but it's not
Oh
Abraham and
wow.
Isaac. So what I think is happening is Abraham and Isaac is a what is it called when you take a myth and you make them into a human? Shit, I can't remember the name of that. There's like a term for it where you take the story of Zeus and you make him a human. I forgot what it's called, but
Oh,
that's what I
okay.
think's happening.
Like
That's
incarnation, I guess, kind of, or
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah,
It's
yeah.
like the Abraham one comes way later. This is an older
Right.
version of this. So he says El sacrifices his only begotten son on an altar to heaven, Uranos. That's who he sacrifices it to.
Hmm.
And then this is what it says, and then he circumcises himself and then decides that from this day forward, the Phoenicians will make it a custom to sacrifice their children on the seventh day of their birth, after their birth.
Wow.
So you get the myth of sacrificing. And by the way, in the Old Testament, it's Abraham who does that. So
Right.
not only does Abraham sacrifice his only son, Abraham is the one who starts the circumcision ritual.
Right.
So now you have two things that line up. You have El, who's the God of Abraham, sacrificing his only son and doing a circumcision. Then in the Hebrew Bible, you get Abraham sacrificing his only son for El, But now he's the one, and he's still the one who makes the circumcision ritual. So that lines up, and then and yeah, so and then Tacitus in the first century or second century, I'm sorry, he just straight out says, I think their God is he's like going back and forth and who the Jews are. I think they're from Crete. They might be from
Yeah.
Libya. I don't really know.
Yeah.
And he says I heard they worship a donkey. He says I also heard they worship Saturn. So there's another source for
Yeah.
that too. So I
And the
think this
donkey will play a tremendously important role in Judaism and obviously in Christianity in the sense of Jesus, entering Jerusalem on an ass,
who
kind
else
of
does
thing.
it?
So you could see that they would Dionysus also is connected to
Dionysus
donkey. Yeah.
rides in Athens on a donkey. Yeah.
Yeah, it's incredible. Okay, let me throw some things out there and get your opinions on this because I'm actually working on a section with Abraham and Isaac right now. So and I haven't fully conceived it in my mind, but so the I mean, the most famous sacrifice in the Torah is the one that never happened. In fact, it is the aborted sacrifice of Isaac, where Yahweh is testing Abraham, and Abraham is this man of faith who's almost like robotic. He was just like, here I am, sacrifice my own son. Here I am. Let's go. And then he's about to do it, and an angel comes down and stops this really at the last moment. But what do you make of all of this? Because there's a lot of, I mean, like a Christian would say that it's a precedent for Christ because Isaac carries wood up to the altar and so on. But again, the significant things here seems to be that he's not sacrificed. And there's this curious line of when Isaac asked his father, he was like, "Well, where is the ram that we're going to sacrifice?" And Abraham says, "My son, Yahweh or God will provide the burnt offering himself." And let me just kind of fully shock you here, maybe a little bit. Um, who is Isaac's father exactly? So Abraham or Abram and Sarai are these old timers, almost 100, and Yahweh makes the covenant with them. You're now Abraham, you're Sarah. This transformation through the covenant. And Yahweh comes down in the form of three men, and he meets Abraham at this tent. And then Yahweh and Sarah go into the tent while Abraham is outside asking what's going on. And Yahweh and Sarah exit the tent together. It's a tent of feast, in fact. Feasting. You maybe could sense where I'm going. I mean, this is Mark Brahman's interpretation, but I'm relaying it. And he comes out, and Sarah's like, "I can't believe that you're going to you make me laugh, Isaac. Can't believe that you would I can conceive a child this day and age." And Yahweh says, "Well, nothing's too difficult for the Lord." So
Right.
the suggestion is that Yahweh, Isaac is Yahweh's son, and
Yeah.
Sarah met Yahweh in a tent, and they had divine sex. Whereupon even someone who's 95 can get pregnant because it's a god after all. Nothing's too difficult for the Lord.
Yeah.
And so
I would agree with that interpretation. I would agree. That
yeah, and it really kind of makes the Bible. I mean, I don't know when you're willing to read the Bible that way, it makes it much more interesting and much more salacious as well.
yeah.
The idea, this would shock the church ladies out there. But so what is going on? What is going on with the Abram? Because you could even read that line, Yahweh will provide the burnt offering himself. So you could read that as the Son of God. Like, let's take the Christological interpretation to its maximum, which is that, yes, Abraham's sacrifices Isaac is like Jesus' sacrifice of himself. Let's take it further. It's the Son of God. But in this way, he's not being sacrificed and he's escaping. So
Well,
What do you make of all this? Because I'm still kind of putting the pieces together myself.
if you think about the Sanchoniathan version, which is older, if
Hmm.
you think about that, in that version, it is God whose son is the one getting sacrificed, and
Yeah.
it's the Yadud character who's playing the role of Isaac. So if it's not anthropomorphized, there's another word for it. I'm
Someone
drawing a
put it
blank.
in the chat. I had not heard it before, but
But
yeah.
when you take God and you turn him into a human, it was a famous Hellenistic era genre. But this yeah dude becomes Isaac in the Gospels or in the Old Testament story,
Hmm.
and so that that interpretation actually does match on. He is the Son of God, and by the way, Yedud, this is crazy. So this is gonna blow your mind.
Hmm.
Yedud is called the only. His name means only begotten son. He's the only
Hmm.
begotten son. So if Isaac is being drawn from this character, that means he's the only begotten son. So
Right.
that means, and people knew this story. Philo-Biblos lived in the first century, so that means people still knew this comparison in the first century. So whoever wrote the Gospels could have had access to both of these texts and could have drew something from both of them and said, because Kronos was a god of human sacrifice.
Hmm.
Did you know that? There's a temple in Carthage to Kronos,
Hmm.
who's Saturn or El, and they found remains of sacrificial victims in these
Sure.
on these altars. So
He's the
Kronos is
god of the harvest as well. I mean, which seems to be a kind of metaphor for sowing and reaping and taking life and so on. Yeah.
yeah. And Aristotle and Plato and all these different sources have they constantly talk about how people in Babylon in the East they sacrificed humans to Kronos, and they're
Hmm.
talking about how horrible it is. I can't believe they do that stuff. Babylonians had a ritual of human sacrifice where they would dress up the victim as a king and put them in purple, put a crown
Hmm.
on their head, and like, well, the Gospels, what
Jesus.
happened
Yeah.
to Jesus? Put
Yeah.
purple on the crown on. It's the human sacrificial story happening in the Gospels, and so when you think about it through that lens of what's going on in the Sanchoniathan version, where it's El who is the God, not Abraham, sacrificing Yedud, who's literally in the text called only begotten son. And
Right.
in that version, he doesn't stop though. He does the sacrifice. He kills him.
Hmm.
And then right after that happens, he circumcises himself, which is also what Abraham does. So that interpretation that you brought up it's fits perfectly.
Hmm.
It's spot on. It's spot on. There's nothing wrong with it. It's absolutely correct.
Well,
Yet
good. I'm
Abraham
glad.
Isaac is definitely some sort of um type of the Son of God character being
Yeah.
sacrificed as absolutely.
Yeah. And I guess the question is, what do we make of it, and why? I mean, what do we make of even the fact that Jesus is killed,
Oh,
and Isaac isn't?
this is the perfect segue to
Uh-huh.
another thing I wanted to say about Dionysus and Jesus. So if you look at the Mithra iconography of him slaying the bull,
Hmm.
that's a sacrifice to save the world. It's a salvation image. Mithra slays the bull, and then you see all the animals feeding on you see the snake and the dog and the eagle, and they're all feasting on and those are all different initiates in the Mithraic order. That's what it
Interesting.
means. But what's the bull? Well, it turns out Dionysus was a bull god. He had horns. He was called the
Hmm.
bull. I can pull up 20 or more sources that say Dionysus is the bull. He's called in the
Yeah.
hymns in
Pentheus
the
chains him to a bull, actually, in the Bacchae,
that's
which is an
that's
interesting thing.
another
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah.
So Euripides is telling you something there. But there's like the Orphic hymn to Dionysus. He calls him bull faced, and Diodorus says he is a bull, like he has a bull horns. Um, and then it's another thing. His in Diodorus's version of Dionysus, Ammon is a ram. Ammon is a Jupiter of the Egyptians, or
Hmm.
Zeus of the. But he's a ram god. He's the horned Ammon, the ram god. His son is Dionysus in this story. So that means you know what a baby ram is? It's a lamb. So it's a
Right.
lamb of God. It doesn't say lamb of God, but you have to like think through that one. But it's
Yeah.
whatever. put that aside for now. The bull thing's even more interesting though, because in other sources he's not a ram. He's a bull. He's called the bull. Franz Kumant, one of my favorite older scholars who died in like the 50s. He's an older, way back. He was like the leading scholar for the Mithraic mysteries. He wrote his books are still better than any. All these modern interpretations of Mithras are coming out today are garbage, and they all try to downplay Franz Kumant as outdated. He's
Mm-hmm.
wrong. He's connecting the Persians to the Romans. You shouldn't do that. They're all wrong. Franz Kumant was right. Anyways, Franz Kumant found in one of these iconographies, there's an inscription on the bowl that says Nama Sabazio. And you're like, what does that mean? I mean, it's an Indo-European old. It's not. We don't even know what language it is. All we know is it's an Indo-European dialect. It means give thanks to Sabazius. Sabazius is the older beer version of Dionysus.
Wow.
So the bull is Dionysus.
Yeah.
The bull, he's the slain victim by Mithra to save the world. So Dionysus dies for everybody. He's the bull of God.
Hmm.
So now think about this. Jesus is the Lamb of God, right? He's the slain victim. His death brings salvation. But then this is where the difference comes in. Dionysus is a bull, is wild, powerful, wild, like just that the bull.
Right.
The bull is the symbol of Wall Street too. It's a symbol of strength and
Yeah.
power. Lamb is the symbol of
Right.
meekness. So
Yeah.
you can see how they're taking the sacrifice myth of Dionysus and they're changing into, instead of the bull being slain, by the way, in the Attis and Kybele mysteries and in the Egyptian Osiris mysteries, during the same festival, the one that's done at the spring equinox,
Mm-hmm.
they would bring in a bull and they would slaughter the bull and they would sprinkle the blood on everybody and they'd be washed in the blood of the bull. I'm
Wow.
swear to God, this is well documented. People would be initiated, or if they would be initiated in the mysteries by sacrificing a bull represented by Dionysus and sprinkling the blood on people to save them and initiate them. Where Jesus is the Lamb of God, and then spirit, they don't actually do the sacrifice, but they interpret it in the text that it says it right in the text, wash in the blood of the Lamb, in the
Mm-hmm.
epistles of John and stuff like that. So that's what's going on here. He's becoming the sacrifice. This is a known thing in the mysteries. So that's what I think. So it's like that. Your question was like, why is Jesus do? Well, it's the mysteries. It's a response to the Greco-Roman mystery cults,
Mm-hmm.
where Jesus becomes, not only is he the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecies from the prophets, he's also fulfilling Greco-Roman mystery religions, and
Hmm.
that's what makes Christianity this universal religion. It's not just a Jewish religion; it's a universal religion.
Right. Yeah, that's fascinating. It's also it's the lamb, the Paschal lamb, the Passover story is also a lamb. I hadn't really thought, and it's a lamb in the thicket that Abraham discovers that he sacrifices in lieu of Isaac.
It all comes full circle. You're like this: the ram in the thicket is the sacrifice,
Right.
and then Diodorus says that Ammon is the ram, and his son is Dionysus. And then in another story, he's a bull, and it's like you're like it's all like different, but it's all. But then when you put them all together, you're like, there's something going on here. There's
Right.
all this overlap happening, and it's like, what do you do with it? Well, I just think there's different authors approaching the same thing in their own
Hmm.
ways, and they're approaching this sacrificial, and it's actually agriculture. So w- the earth dies every year in the winter, and then
Hmm.
it revives itself in the spring.
Hmm. Right.
So there's an agricultural layer behind all this. But what Platonism does is and so Platonism comes along and it takes all these pagan nature worship models and it spiritualizes them. So no longer is it agricultural. Now it's spiritual. Now it's
Hmm.
Jesus. Jesus sort of replaces the pagan stories because you don't have to do the sacrifice anymore. You just believe in Jesus. So it's like a Platon. It's like he's like the ultimate form of the Son of God. If you were to take
Yeah.
if you were Platonic form of the Son of God, you get Jesus. And there's another one of this. There's another god who arose at the same time as Jesus. His name is Ion.
Mm-hmm.
And Ion is just like Jesus in many ways because he's a synchronistic deity. If you look into the Suda, the Byzantine Suda, they say they don't know if he's Osiris, they don't know if he's Attis, they don't know if he's another Dionysus, they don't know if he's. They're like, who is this god? He's like, he seems to be a mixture of all these gods, like
Mm-hmm.
Jesus. But
Mm-hmm.
then Epiphanius, I love this text. This Christian saint Epiphanius, he fucked up. He should have never preserved this text because we lost it, but it's preserved in Epiphanius because he wants to talk shit about it. So because he's arguing about this, we have it. But what he says is this god Ion in Egypt was worshipped and they celebrated his birth on December 25th.
Mm-hmm.
And they said he was the son of the Virgin.
Mm-hmm.
And then they said that the Cori, which is Persephone, which is the name of
Mm-hmm.
Dionysus' mother, gives birth to Ion in a cave in Egypt. And every year on the winter solstice, they celebrate this. That's what he says. Epiphanius says this. It's talking about a pagan god, not Jesus. Because he's arguing, his argument is they're copying Jesus. That's what he says. And he's
Right.
wrong. And I'm so glad he did this because it's so easy to see through this shit. But then he says it, and then he gives us another example. He goes, there's another god named Dusharis, and he's in Arabia. He's worshipped in Petra, the famous Petra built in those crazy desert dwelling buildings that look Roman as hell. Um, he says over in Petra they worship this god named Dushares, whose name in Arabic means only begotten son, and his mother
Mm.
Kubaba is the virgin. He gives us two examples of two pagan gods who are the only begotten son, who are born of a virgin on December 25th. And then his argument is they're copying Jesus. But then you find out, when you look into this, those gods are older.
Interesting.
He screwed up big time by saying he should have never said a word because we wouldn't know about that. That's
Yeah.
the only source that mentions that is this Christian text.
Right.
Otherwise, otherwise it's gone.
What do you make of the idea that Plato seems to valorize Kronos vis-a-vis Zeus? Yeah, I mean, you could even see like Hesiod in a way valorizing Kronos. It's the golden age, which is when Kronos existed. But when an idea of a golden age is mentioned in Plato as well, it's like a time before Zeus. It seems to be an inherently, at least for a Greek, at that time period, a kind of inherently subversive thing. It's like someone in the 1950s America talking about like, oh, let's remember the, religion of the Native Americans or the, our pagan ancestry. It seems to be kind of inherently subversive to the existing order. But what do you make of that? That there and but also if we think of Plato as kind of, Platonism is or Christianity's Platonism for the people. Platonism kind of like forming the intellectual framework for Christianity. It's fascinating that he's pointing towards Kronos as God. But anyway, I'll let you respond to that.
Yeah. So you have this idea of when Saturn ruled or Kronos, there
Right.
was a golden age where everybody was equal. No one had to work. Everyone just had abundant wine and food all day because
Right.
Kronos provided everything. And this is what they at Saturnalia festival, they would take this ancient statue of Kronos laying back, reclined on a couch, and
Mm-hmm.
there's an opening in his head, and they would fill it with oil.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, oh, that's crazy because Christ needs to anoint with oil. I'm like,
Right.
that's weird. But so if you had this god who's considered to be when he ruled, there was a golden age, everything was perfect. Then when he gets killed by Zeus or overthrown by Zeus,
Mm-hmm.
he sent down to Hades. But he's Zeus or Saturn is such an important deity. He can't just be another resident of Hades. He's given his own realm to rule down there,
Right.
which is called Elysium. And
Mm-hmm.
that's Elysium is where people go when they completed their life and they are become maybe it's like apotheosis.
Mm-hmm.
It means exit because they believe in reincarnation. It's called metempsychosis in Greek. and it means if you're going through metempsychosis, it means you're not perfect yet. You're not a god yet. You're still mortal. You still have things to
Mm-hmm.
work on. You're a shitty person. You're not worthy. And then there's Tartarus, where they torture people if you're really shitty. But most people just get reincarnated. But Saturn rules this realm called Elysium, and that's where all the gods go, and that's where all the perfected human beings who exit reincarnation. That's where you want to go. It's like very Buddhist in a way. You want to exit reincarnation. You don't want to keep reincarnated. So that's where Saturn rules. But it's you're talking about Platonism. There's a text from the 2nd century. It's called the Handbook of Platonism. It's written
Mm-hmm.
by a guy named Elkinus, and you can get a copy of it online in English.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, some scholars translated it, but this text was the considered to be the source that was given to teachers of Platonism across the Roman Empire. So they would copy these texts and they would send them to all the major cities, and whoever's teaching Platonism in that city would work out of this book. So they had an actual education system in
Textbook.
Platonism.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. In this text, they talk about the golden age, but they change it. They go, it's not Saturn that gave us the golden age; it's Prometheus. They change it.
Oh, fascinating.
So, I forgot which chapter it is. It's in there somewhere, and I think it's right in the beginning actually. But he does look it up for yourself, and they say everyone thinks the golden age was given by Saturn, but really we
Mm-hmm.
know that Prometheus is the one who provided and created humans, and the golden age is actually his.
Hmm.
So I don't know what to make of that. So, but I don't know. I think that sort of covers what you were asking, right?
Yeah, I don't fully know what to make of it as well. But even if you think of like Aeschylus's drama Prometheus Bound, again, you're invited to sympathize with Prometheus who's being tortured by Zeus. I mean, it's if you think of it in a modern context, it's like asking someone to sympathize with the Pharisees or something. It's a weird like turn, in this festival. I mean, these were Greek people were under an Olympian system, period. And you're invited to sympathize with the figure that God is torturing. It's very curious and very subversive.
I just thought of it too because Saturn, like Dionysus,
Hmm.
he's an egalitarian god. He's
Yeah.
a because
You're all one to him. He's going to harvest you
yeah,
up. Yeah.
golden age, nobody worked. Everybody just had fun at wine. Everybody just had it was like
Yeah.
paradise. It was the Garden of Eden. But Prometheus is a forward thinking creation. He's giving technology and fire. He's
Right.
the opposite. He's not the everyone just sit around do nothing all day. He's
Right.
let's draw. We have a point. We have a fixed linear progress. Go like let's get
Hmm.
there. Let's get to the Ubermensch. Basically, that's what it is. But what was I going to say? Saturn during Saturnalia, they would say the slaves are free during this week. In fact,
Yes.
they had what's called the King of Saturnalia. And the King of Saturnalia was one of the slaves would become the king of the
Yeah.
household for the whole day, for the whole week or whatever. So for Saturn to be the golden age requires a political, I guess, mindset or a philosophical mindset of equality. And Prometheus being the golden age requires an almost opposite mindset. So whatever so that's probably why this Platonist decided to change this sort of order from Saturn into Prometheus. That's my
Yeah.
best
I
guess.
mean, maybe. I mean, it's yeah, I can see where you're definitely going that. I mean, Prometheus is he's almost like a Vulcan-like figure. He's a worker, craftsman, but he's bringing technology to the people. So it's maybe I don't know. I guess I
Well,
might
there's
stress
a
a little bit of an egalitarian quality to Prometheus as well. But it's something it needs to be thought through because I agree there's something there.
yeah, and as far as Vulcan, there were people who thought that Vulcan was equivalent to Prometheus.
Hmm.
And so some of the versions of the Prometheus story of when Athena is born, the oldest versions are Prometheus. Then there's
Hmm.
there's versions that come later, and it's Prometheus is completely taken out of the story, and it's Hephaestus or Vulcan
Mm-hmm.
doing what Prometheus does in that story. So these Greeks in Hellenistic times thought that Hephaestus was a good replacement for Prometheus. But what that does tell me is that Prometheus is a from a different place. It tells me that Prometheus is probably like Hephaestus being the Greek metallurgy god, or who is Ptah in Egypt,
Mm-hmm.
uh, is from a different era and a different approach to something that's like technological. But Prometheus, when he's killed in Prometheus Bound, he's tied to a Scythian cliff, which
Mm-hmm.
means there's probably he's probably the name Prometheus sounds very. He's probably in some sort of ancient Indo-European creator god, but he's also connected to the god Enki in this of the Sumerians.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually found out that Enki predates the Semitic influence of Sumeria. He's that old.
Hmm.
So they don't say he's Indo-European. They just say like it's the native tongue of that
Mm-hmm.
region. Like there, it's called local, or I think it's called like language local. It means like he's not Indo-European. It's not Semitic. It's just from this place. Like
Mm-hmm.
it's just from that place. It's not from anywhere. But Enki has the same story where he's the creator of humans. He's also a trickster. He's
Mm-hmm.
also creating plots to defy Enlil, who is
Mm.
Jupiter's. So it's the perfect. It's the same deity, and in the story of Ishtar saving Tammuz and descending into hell and rising back up,
Mm-hmm.
Enki actually helps her out. She's about to lose. She's about to get screwed over and die. And Enki creates a good looks playboy. That's what it says in the text. That's how they translate the Sumerian. Good looks playboy, like Orpheus. And he sends him down there to like go and like charm the queen of hell, queen
Right.
of Hades, to
Yeah.
save Ishtar. That's something Prometheus would do. Prometheus is
Yeah.
he's a trickster thinker, and he's always trying to defy Enlil or
Yeah.
Zeus.
Yeah.
So there's something going on with that.
Definitely. Let's do this. We so does anyone want to ask some questions from the audience? And we can, we can kind of keep this around 2 hours. I think that's a lot. You've been very generous with your time, and I think that's a good amount
Having
here.
fun.
But um, yeah, I've learned quite a bit actually, and rethought some things as well. So I appreciate it. But would anyone like to jump in with a question? You can raise your hand, or just ask away.